Hi everyone. Thank you for accepting my paper to be presented here. I'm really excited to be here. So my research is not as detailed as Anran's, but it does write off of his and both Dashdorj and Anran's introduction, because now that they've given an overview of the situation at the time, I can talk about what happened next. So my paper is about land reform, so clearly it's an economic issue. The reason why land reform is important is that it shows, it's a good indicator of how much power the power balance had been moving throughout the years. So as we've seen, Anran showed that the Chinese Communist Party had been step by step taking over control in eastern Inner Mongolia in the late 1940s. But the truth is that on the ground, where the property was, everything was still kind of in Mongolian hands. So for a little bit of background, I'm sure a lot of people are really familiar with this. Since the Qing days, Inner Mongolia is kind of divided into Shun, or they call it banners. It's in the Manchu system. And all of the banner land for pastoralism was publicly owned. So there was no private ownership of land. And at the end of the Qing dynasty, because of the Qing dynasty's own economic problems, and they had a lot of reparations to pay since the Opium War, and like disaster after disaster happened to this regime, so they had to raise more money. And the way they did this, and one of the ways in which they did this, is to take over land in southern Inner Mongolia, which could be planted cultivated. So they took over these lands in the form of sending Chinese peasants there to rent land at first, and sort of just decreeing to the Mongolian nobility to offer land up for this arrangement. That way they could tax the peasants who were farming this land and therefore make money. So what happened? The effect of this was that since 1907, or even earlier, 1901 even in some cases, a lot of times Chinese peasants started to be sent in. So it wouldn't be accurate to say there was no cultivation before this. The Mongolians themselves would cultivate some of the time, and they would, but their cultivation technique was mostly different, because they would just do it without irrigation, to put it shortly. This is important because the Chinese people's way of irrigating caused a lot more damage to the pastures. So that eventually caused a lot more problems. But in the Qing period, and also later on in the Republic of China period, more and more land was put in under cultivation, and this caused a lot more ethnic tension on the ground. So a lot of the pastoralist families would have to move away from this like prime pastures, which were mostly prized, and they would have to compete with others, and so it caused a lot of problems on the ground. And in the late 1940s, what happened was that the Chinese Communist Party came in, and they wanted to do class struggle. So it's part of their ideology to say all the land and animals need to be taken from the rich and given to the poor. But the problem is that at this time, most of the rich, so-called rich, were Mongolians, and a lot of them were monks and lamas, and temple had a lot of land. A lot of the banner land was considered under rich people's control, and they just kind of didn't really take into account that there was a lot more to the pastoral arrangement than just rich and poor. Because a lot of time, pastoralism itself is kind of a risky business. A lot of times people lose many animals, and they don't have anything, and they have to rely on other people. So the way they did this was that the rich would loan out some animals, and they would divide up the products in different various shares, and it's called the suruk system. Suruk teuh is the Mongolian name for it. So this was kind of taken as a exploitative economic relationship. So now that the communists are here, they trained up a bunch of people. For example, in one of the case study I want to present today, in Baron, they took 100 youths from the poor echelons of the society and trained them to be communists and how to struggle people and how to do the property redistribution. So they would come come to the countryside and start agitating people to take away property from the rich. And yeah, so that's so this is Eastern Inner Mongolia is interesting here because it came under the influence of the Chinese Communist Party first. As we've seen, the western part of Inner Mongolia was still under the Kuomintang's control. Their army was there, and also in Manchuria itself, there was a lot of battles happening between the two parties of China. So in a way, Eastern Inner Mongolia became very important strategically, both because it's the corridor that connects this Manchuria area to China proper, but also there's a lot of resources here to be exploited. So it seems like the Chinese Communist Party considered this area to be important for their for getting provisions. So when I look at the Wenshan, these are local histories published in Inner Mongolian banners, and it's kind of everywhere, but it's not specifically for history per se. They're like cultural things and like personal biographies in these collections. What I see is that there's a lot of like parallel narratives of provisioning for the army, the Chinese Communist Party's army, the Eighth Route Army, and class struggle at the same time. They don't put the two together, but it's happening at the same time. So what's basically happening is people, there are communist cadres trained to go and provision for the government, and at the same time, there are like wealth redistribution also happening. Right. So, that's the first part I'm trying to explain. The 1947 to 8 part. So the land and livestock redistribution in this period really became very chaotic. It's not clear who exactly was in charge. Like different historians have different views on it. But for example, Liu Shouyuan is one of the historians on Chinese ethnic policies in Yubin. His theory is that the Inner Mongolians themselves, the IMPRP that Ashtung and Ren both talked about with the leader called Hafenwa, they were so radical that they did the class struggle themselves, and they were mostly in control on the ground. But Professor Atwood's paper from the 1990s argued that the IMPRP in this period was really under the direction of the Manchurian Bureau, the Northeast Bureau of the Chinese Communist Party. So from what I read in these documents is that there were definitely leaders sent from the Chinese Communist Party to carry this out. And it's kind of interesting because the Chinese records themselves, they all say that they were like leftist errors. And whenever it's kind of like their way of admitting that a lot of mistakes were made. And of course, they put it in like very mild terms of saying, too many people were struggled against, they were beatings on every session, and too many people were killed. So we don't really have numbers in how many people were killed, how much was taken, what exactly happened, but that's definitely there. But at the same time, there's also records of in 1947, there were purges on this land redistribution, livestock redistribution process because a lot of the cadres apparently had erred on the right side by not distributing enough. So it's kind of happening at the same time, and I see it as the taking away of power from the Mongolian indigenous political movements here, because this land reform campaign really went way radical. Like, I'll move on to the next slide so it can show you an example. So this is the percentage of people who were classified as economic exploiters and therefore struggled against and dispossessed. So in these couple of example banners, 20-something% of the population became exploiters. And that's kind of unrealistic even in compared to other places in China proper, and the average was more like 7% in most places. So it's clearly this caused a lot of problems. It seems like there was a lot of fighting on the ground too, but there's no like clear stories of that. They're just like general summaries of saying we increased the number of enemies made on the ground, and we didn't include enough people to put on our own side, therefore it was a leftist mistake. So there's a map. So this map's kind of been talked about before already, so I'll just skip it. So I looked at the documents from Baden specifically. Baden is two banners in eastern central Inner Mongolia, and it was under Manchukuo control during before or until the Second World War ended. So here, when they determined the class, specifically, this is the way they divided up. If you did no labor and relied on the products that your herders would provide to you, you would be a herd lord, and therefore in the worst possible situation. And if you did some labor and more than 15% of your income came from these tenant farmers or suruk arrangement and herders, then you would be a rich herder, and which is also a bad situation. So for everybody else, they would instead receive the redistributed wealth. An interesting part from this that I noticed is that there were a lot of cash and like gold and silver confiscated everywhere, and they were redistributed. And this is one example in they call it Yanchan. The other day, Professor Ad was showing me an example. These are like Mexican or like South American minted coins and silver dollars. And for example, in this area, it's a small town or small area. They found over 1,000 pieces of these, and they redistributed this to people in this proportion: 15 per person for the very poor, and 5 per person for the poor herder, etc. But in the end, the note says this was distributed in the form of stocks. So the stock was for the rural cooperation, and at this point, the people's cooperatives haven't been formed yet. But certainly, the cash and all the treasures were not given back to the people. Whatever was confiscated that was useful, it seems like somebody else above took them and distributed them in the form of stocks. In terms of animals, sheep, for example, was distributed to people according to the number of household size. You have more people in your family, you get more sheep. But horse was distributed according to household. So each household would get 1 horse, for example. And so animals were distributed away like this. And clothing and other household equipments were given out to the poorer echelons, and with preferential treatment for the very poor. So afterwards, in 1948, late 1948, Odlanhu was like more in control. Odlanhu, we've seen him already. He's very important later on. So they kind of changed the redistribution requirement. So instead of 15% of the income coming from suruk, and then you're a rich herder, they made it like 25% in Baden at this time. This is significantly different from what happened later on, because in 1940, yes, in May 1949, the Jeweled League, which at this point was drawn into the Chinese province called Rehe. It's a created province. The Republic of China created in 1928 in order to split up Inner Mongolia to speed up its colonization process. And a lot of the records from that time would just straight up say, we need to colonize Inner Mongolia, therefore send more colonizers there to cultivate. And in 1949, Odlanhu was able to use his influence within the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, he had a lot of influence to put Inner Mongolia back together. And this is around the time the Chinese Communist Party won against the Kuomintang. And Odanko brought in a whole set of different policies for redistribution. So at this point, a lot of the class drawn were like changed to like 50% of the income coming from exploitative economic relations as a cutoff point. But Odanko was able to use his influence to start this 3 don't and 2 benefit policy, so to speak. It's kind of well known because it kind of excuses the entire pastoral population from this fiasco. And 3 don't is basically don't do class struggle, don't divide up class distinctions, and don't confiscate property. And the 2 benefit is that benefit both the herd lord and benefit the herder. So basically what they did is just change the fee paid to the herder to raise it up a little bit, and it's clearly not even that much, as David Sneath book shows. And a lot of the examples I see also show that the old Suruk system wasn't as exploitative as they make it seem. I could show some examples later on. So this policy started in the 1940-1950 and continued throughout the first 5-year plan. And although during the first 5-year plan some cultivation happened, but Odanko was able to stop the drive to cultivate, to say the herders really needed this resource for their existence. Therefore, it shouldn't be drawn into the same category as the Chinese general policy of land reform. So this happened until the infamous Great Leap Forward. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about this. That's the second 5-year plan. And at that time, Odanko's influence was basically reduced, and he was accused of a lot of nationalism. And so that's when more land was turned into cultivated land, and pastures were taken away. I'd like to make 2 more points. It seems like I've run out of time. So in the mid-1950s, the collectivization happened. So in 1955, the people's cooperatives were created, and these were basically superimposed on top of the BUG. BUG is basically like a township. It's a small rural unit. And it wasn't as disruptive because people's livestock weren't confiscated, and people were basically just told to help each other, milk or something like that. So lives didn't really change. But by 1958, everybody was compelled to join it. And then afterwards, in the second 5-year plan, the people's communes were created from a decree from Mao, basically. So over 11,000 rural cooperatives were overnight converted to like 800 people's communes, and these are huge. And that's basically the end of private property in Inner Mongolia for this period until a long way, several decades later. The other point I want to make was basically this inherent tension between national self-determination and class struggle. And this is this theme that a lot of historians have written on. For example, Orkin Bodlog and Liu Shoyan and Professor Adru too. So we could talk about that later, but basically the Chinese Communist Party, despite promising self-determination under the Soviet model, and I mean, despite his bad reputation, Stalin really kind of created this federalist system where the Soviet socialist republics had their own language, and they were like made to create their titular ethnicity, titular language, titular writing system, and all these things. And it seemed like this communist revolutionary current was designed to kind of uplift the oppressed small nationalities, and that's the rhetoric that they used. So it appears that Odanko and a lot of the early leaders of Inner Mongolia really believed that ideology, and they tried to implement it on the ground. But from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, they thought class struggle is the more important thing. So class struggle in Inner Mongolia basically meant take from the Mongolian communities and give it to Chinese settled farmers, because their entire notion of property and land is based on settled lifestyle land property, that entire paradigm. So clearly we know which side won. So yeah, I'll end my presentation here and take any questions.
Thank you very much. So I'm sure we have lots of questions. So please. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sort of interested. So you write a lot about livestock, but what other sort of resources were implicated in land reform? Like, for example, the access to salt. How did that change?
Right. So aside from livestock, the main resource in the rural Mongolian areas would be pastures. So before land reform, people used like customary pastures, and a lot of the nobility and the temples would have access to the best pastures. So once the livestock is divided, people are all the pastures declared to be national property, so everybody could graze on it, and therefore a lot of the prime pastures kind of distributed to poorer people. In terms of salt, like what I've read about salt is that harvesting of the salt is done by the community. So people, remember the stocks I was talking about, people could use that stock to purchase salt mined communally, for example. Yeah. So aside from that, the tools and implements and clothing were also important, and they were taken from people who had a lot of them and given to people who didn't.
Was sort of redistributed, people transgressing the ingredient standard boundaries,
right.
degree, and just sort of.
So people would still graze within their banners, but it wasn't like distributed as property yet, because pasture is still communal property. But instead of saying like that nice area, that field, which usually the Taj used to put his sheep on in the summer, for example, all the sheep is distributed to other people and everybody can use it. So basically, it's kind of like free for all. Like, but I'm sure that there were like local customs still governing the people. One example I have from my paper is in Asha. And Asha is much farther from this, the western end of the Inner Mongolian Autonomous Region. And there, basically the only change is that people still use their customary pastures, but they would sometimes take their animals to where the Wang used to put his animals there, things like that.
Yes, in the back.
Well, I haven't done research myself on it, but taken classes. But to add to that, touches on this subject. So the difference in Outer Mongolia is that there's like the collectivization process happened in the 1950s, and it seems like there was a lot less violence, and the people's mobility weren't affected as much, and so it was a milder case.
Well, I think as we can see from Anran's paper, one of the points about collectivization, particularly about land reform, was that it was also being used simultaneously as a way for the Communist Party to build a direct connection, to start training cadres directly, and thereby isolate the Inner Mongolian autonomous leaders. And that political dynamic, of course, didn't exist in the case of independent Mongolia, where the government also had been around for much longer. Probably a better comparison with Inner Mongolia, with what happened in the 40s in Inner Mongolia, might be what happened in the early 30s in Mongolia. I often think, basically, when you're talking about revolutionary governments, you need to stop thinking about years of like 1947, 1956 or something, and think about the revolution's year zero. So what's going on for example, in Mongolia, 1931 is year 10, and 1941 is year 20. In China, if we take maybe 1945 to be Inner Mongolia, 1945, therefore 1955 is year 10. So, the different types of different chronologies need to be paid attention to. Yes. Dotno was Mongolian.
제가 몽골에서 약 40-40 оны үеийн баянуудыг 활약했는데 энэ үед шашны өвтөнтөг японочууд ашиглахныг онцлог байсан. Тэр нь бол юу гэсэн дээр монголчууд өсөж ихтэй байсан. Ялангуяа 8 дугаар одоо монгол хатантыг явуулсан. Тэр 8 дугаар 24 он таас болсны дараа монголчууд одоо Монголыгоо дахин тодруулъя гэсэн ийм сонирхолтой байсан. Тэр сонирхол дээр нь одоо японочууд бас тэрийг ашиглаж байдлаар үүсгээд тэгээд дэмжигдэн руу ноёны хүүг эсвэл Монголд тодруулъя гэсэн ийм бодлогыг тэгээд тэрийг дэлгүүрийн бас айлтжсэн. Японочууд болсон, хүү монголчууд болсон. Тэгээд ийм нэг зүйл байдаг. Энэ талаар илүү одоо судалгаа байна уу, ямар нэгэн
So, for those of you who don't speak Mongolian, he asked about, this was a period of the 30s and 40s, there was a lot of movements, nationalist movements, but this was also, religion also played a part in this. For example, the 8th Balkh, who was the founder of the Egyptian Dambahotok, was the founder of Mongolian independence. So he was very important in that. And then when he passed away in 1924, there was a question of whether there would be an identification of another one. So the Japanese were also interested in using Buddhism for their own aims in Inner Mongolia. So Dimchik Dongrup, who was the leader of the Western Mongolian autonomous government, he was attempting to identify a 9th Balkh. And the Dilu Hotuk, who was an incarnate lama from Mongolia who had fled to Inner Mongolia and was living there, he also played some role in that, as Japanese were also interested in that. So he's asking you three, in your research, have you seen more documents, more interesting materials about religion and the role of religion in this period?
Well, I guess I haven't seen any documents myself, but I read a paper on that specific subject. I think it was by Nakami Tatsuo, the Japanese name. So he said that Dimchik Dongrup Wang actually was against it. You know? He thought that the Japanese were really being exploitative and trying to lie. It seems like he was of this really honest character. He didn't want to do anything to exploit the situation and make his own son the next reincarnation. So that kind of like died down after that, is what I read.
You guys see it? Did you, in your work, was there any discussion of religion or Buddhism? You mentioned that in revolutionary youth party that religion represent.
I'm not working on this anymore.
All right. Well, so as you can all smell, there's some really wonderful food. So I think we'll all wrap it up here for a very wonderfully focused and detailed and really rich session. Thank you very much to all the panelists.